we're going to focus on your connection to Los Angeles art, and just start off by saying that we're sitting here with Hans Neuendorf in the offices of Artnet on Tuesday, February 8th.
Mhm.
And Hans, you mentioned to me at one point that you came to Los Angeles on a whim by seeing an image of a Bob Graham piece in a
Yeah.
box. And maybe you can start off by telling us that anecdote.
Yeah, that's how it happened. You know, what evolved was a long relationship with California and California artists. I saw a small, very small reproduction of an early Graham piece in a German art magazine. I don't know how it got there. And I thought this was just absolutely wonderful and curious and all that. And I made up my mind to go to California, where I hadn't ever been. So I flew to California and went out and looked for the street where most of the galleries were. It was kind of hard. I had no idea how big LA is and all that. So I finally, in the afternoon, found La Cienega Boulevard. And I found Nick Wilder's gallery, and I found Irving Blum's gallery, and Felix Landau Allen Gallery, where I bought my first batch of Hockney paintings. And then on that very first day, Nick Wilder took me around all the artist studios in California, all the artists that he represented. So there was Ed Ruscha, there was Ron Davis, Robert Graham, Tom Holland, Joe Good, Richard Yokomi, who you may not remember. I don't know if you remember him. He was hot at the time, and Bill Pettit, but also Ed Moses and Billy Al and all of those people. And subsequently, I bought some pieces from Bob Graham, and I also invited him to London the following year to do a number of prints with me. I was doing etchings and lithographs by artists that I liked. And Alan Jones was one of them, mostly English pop art. But then Bob started to work in London and lived in London for a while. And then I also bought collections or exhibitions from California artists like Billy Al Bengston. I bought 3 exhibitions over a longer period of time from him. The first one was Dentos, like the one in the background. And that was because it didn't make that much sense to borrow artworks from an artist, ship it all the way to Germany, and then if you couldn't sell it, ship it all the way back. And of course, at the time, it was impossible to sell. Nobody was interested in it. We had a bit of press, and so I tried to promote California art by doing a West Coast exhibition, which put together 3 or 4 artworks by each of the artists that I was working with and presented it in a museum in Germany. And it traveled to 4 places in Germany, and that was a successful exhibition. I think I've shown you the catalog. And some of the works that are in there I still own. So in the following years, many of the artists also came to see me in Hamburg, where I had my gallery. And I remember particularly, and you saw that photograph of Larry Bell up on top of this big World War II bunker that I had my gallery in, because they had the biggest rooms available for very little money. And so we took a photograph of him up there, and we had photographs of Ed Ruscha taken up there. And we did exhibitions of all these people over there. And it was a wonderful and lively time that I had with them.
So can we just back up? Essentially, you just covered everything that I wanted to ask you in about 2 minutes.
Well, that's good, huh?
Are you okay?
I just want to adjust it.
But can we just back up just to the very beginning first? Could you tell us what year you came to Los Angeles? And when you mentioned it before, I think you told us that first, what was LA like at that time? And that you went downtown, you're looking for where the art world is, but where was the art world? And it sounded like, you had a very long bus ride and a very long walk.
That is very true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So first just
Oh, you
give
remember
us-
that?
Yeah. Well, first tell us the year.
Yes.
Yeah, tell us
Well,
the
I
year
did
and the
have a
whole-
long bus ride, because from LA Airport, I took a bus and it was going to downtown Los Angeles. And I thought that might be about right. And I kept asking the bus driver, where's the gallery district? Because I expected something like Soho or something there, or Madison Avenue. And he looked at me as if I was a little crazy. And at one stop after the other went by, and the city didn't end, and it was going on and on. It was getting dark. I couldn't see anything, you know. I finally got off someplace where I saw a hotel sign, and it happened to be on Vine, and it was a hotel in Hollywood. And I was very lucky because no one told me where it was and what it was. So I stayed overnight in that hotel, and then the next morning I picked up a plan from the front desk showing LA. And I looked at all the streets and I said, oh, I had found out that the galleries are on La Cienega Boulevard because I had heard about Nick Wilder, and I looked him up in the phone book. So I thought, okay, that's not too bad. I walked 10 blocks to La Cienega Boulevard, you know. But they had omitted all the small streets. And I ended up with a very long walk arriving at LA at Nick Wilder at around 3 p.m. And he was very helpful and very nice, and immediately put me up at the Chateau Marmont, where the Rolling Stones were staying also at the same time. And you know, so that was the right place for me to go to. And I stayed there, and then he got me a car, but I didn't have a driver's license on me. So I borrowed David Hockney's Ford Falcon, and I passed my test in the Ford Falcon. And then I was able to rent a car and get around Los Angeles, because there were no buses, taxis, or anything. I was just not familiar with the situation there. And that's how my first day in California went. And then the next day, Nick Wilder took me through all the artist studios. And that's how I got all of them. You know, I learned, I got to know all of them. And that was Nick's way, you know. He took the opportunity to, you know, a dealer coming from far away, you know, he was right on it.
Set the scene for us a little bit. What year was this when you came?
I think it was in 67. It was in 67, yeah.
Can you just start at the beginning? You know, you came to Los Angeles in 1967, and then will you tell us like what Nick Wilder was like as a person and what type of artist that he was representing?
Well, I came to Los Angeles in 1967 for the first time on a hunch, because I had seen this reproduction of a Graham piece in there. And my only idea of making contact with the artist was to go to his gallery, which I knew was Nick Wilder Gallery on La Cienega Boulevard. And then I went there and talked to him, and he took me around to all the studios. First of all, to Graham, of course. And I bought a piece from Graham, one of the early plexiglass pieces, with figures inside, which I then carried on my knees all the way back to to Hamburg, because obviously I couldn't check it, and you know, gave me a big problem with the airline, because they didn't want me to carry it on. But of course, the security craze at that time wasn't on, so we did that. And Nick was extraordinarily helpful and nice to me, and very, very open in introducing me to all his artists, and he helped me subsequently also in buying works from the artists, you know. And I bought exhibitions, as I said, by Joe Good also, and Billy Al Bengston, and Tom Holland, and Larry Bell, and many of the others. And so that's how I.
And what was your sense of these artists working in Los Angeles at the time? How was it different from Europe? Was there a sense of that there was something unique, or there was a camaraderie between these artists, or what was your sense of them all as a group and then maybe individually?
Well, I didn't experience a particular camaraderie among the artists. I learned, you know, I got to know them one by one in their studios. And, you know, from there you might conclude that they were actually rather isolated, each one of them. I think that the main point that was there, I think the activity of the galleries was what united them, and particularly Nick Wilder and Irving Blum. And Irving was going more for the New York schools, for Stella and Warhol and things, but also Bengston and Rocher. And Nick tried many things, also unknown artists, and I liked that very much about him. He was always very experimental.
When did you open your gallery in Hamburg?
I opened in 1963, at the end of 1963, with the pop art exhibition. The first pop art exhibition that I did was, I think, in 1965. I borrowed all these paintings that I showed there from Ileana Sonnabend, who had just opened in Paris, and brought them to Hamburg in an old truck, only with a canvas around them. And you know, there were Jasper Johns paintings and Warhol and Lichtenstein and Rauschenberg, 3 large Rauschenberg paintings and all that. Driving myself in the truck.
Was your sense in LA at that time that there was a market and that the galleries were selling?
No, that wasn't my sense at all. It was very, very quiet on La Cienega Boulevard. The city was not as lively as it is today. It seemed to be much smaller and more sedate and more almost provincial, I would say. And the artists, it was unlike New York, where the artists all met in bars, and you know, but there are certain places where you could always meet them, and big openings and all that. It was very different in California. So you walked into any exhibition on La Cienega, there was never anyone there. And I think there were very, very few collectors, whom I got to know also over the years, like Marsha Wiseman was there, and Armand was there at the time, and he collected. And so very few people that actually bought something. And when you look at some of the stickers behind the paintings that I subsequently bought by California artists, you see, you know, collectors' names in the history of these. There were very few people. Small, very small. So they were very interested in selling something to Hamburg. And in Hamburg, obviously, nobody knew what to do with this.
What was the response in Hamburg when you would have, you know, the first exhibition of Bengston's, you know?
Polite. They looked at this, they thought, yeah, well, just, you know, maybe good some. But, you know, there was no art scene there either. You know, I sold to my dentist.
What was the first, do you remember what the first California show you did in Hamburg was?
No, I don't recall. I think it was a group show. I think it was a group show. And then I followed up with individual exhibitions. But I don't recall in which order. It's a long time ago.
Yeah. Do you remember going to the studios? Where was Graham's? Was he in Venice at that point?
No, he was not in Venice. He was in South Ogden Drive, in a little house where he lived with a front lawn.
Can you start off with Bob Graham? You know.
Well, Bob Graham lived in a little house on South Ogden Drive, which was a bourgeois neighborhood, and you know, he was married, and you know, he had this little boy, Stephen, and he worked in a small room in the house. He didn't have a large studio, so obviously at the time he did these plateaus or little environments with the plexiglass boxes and small wax figures for females, and that he could do on the kitchen table. Later on, when he started to work with bronze, obviously he needed assistance, he needed he needed instruments, he needed more space. And that's when he was looking. That was when he came back from London, where I had invited him to do prints. He then looked in Venice, where other artists had their studios. I think mostly Billy Al Bengston was on Mildred, which is just only about 100 yards from Windward, as you know. And so he took the studio on Windward, which had previously been rented by Doug Wheeler. And Doug moved someplace else, and Bob took the studio from Doug. It was the old Venice department store. They had taken the top 4 stories off because of earthquake concerns, and so there was only the ground floor left. And there was a window quite high above the ground, maybe about 10 feet above the ground, and he built a little podium inside the studio, which had a small table and 2 chairs on them. And that's where we hung out and looked at the girls going by to the beach. And he wanted to, he had a problem finding models who were willing to pose for an unknown artist or not very well known artist. So we were looking out for the teenagers coming by on the roller skates and all that. And once in a while we would send out his assistant to talk to the girls, you know, and persuade them to come in. So she persuaded them to come in, and sometimes they were actually posing for him. And many of the early sculptures, like Heather, for instance, the early bronzes, you know, were girls that we found in this way.
And then tell us about his visit to London and what type of work that he did there.
Well, I invited him to London to do prints with Editions Alecto. I was partnering with Editions Alecto doing prints. We did Jim Dine prints, we did Alan Jones, Edoardo Paolozzi, David Hockney, and the like. And print business was an interesting business at the time, and I was getting involved in that. And that was an idea to do that with him as a way of promoting his work. And so he came to London. He found an apartment on Tite Street, which later on belonged to Christine Keeler, you know, the famous scandal woman with the former Minister of Defense, Profumo. And in that apartment, he had a little room, and he worked there. And he did the same work as in Los Angeles, small environments with plexiglass boxes, with little models of girls in there. And he did that for, I think, 2 years. And at the time, he was quite successful, beginning to be quite successful. The Whitechapel Gallery, which was run by Nick Sirota later on, did an exhibition of his work, and you've seen the catalog. There's these early pieces that he did in London. And Ileana Sonnemann did an exhibition, and there were exhibitions at my gallery as well as other galleries in Europe. So he made a name for himself in Europe with these environments. And strangely, that stopped when he started to do bronzes. Even although the first bronzes were like the environments, just without the plexiglass, and the figures were cast in bronze. People didn't like them as much as the little voyeuristic plexiglass plateaus, tableaus that he did. So his early fame rested entirely on the attraction of these voyeuristic pieces. And so he liked London very much, and obviously he liked the good life, and we did some good business, and he asked me to get him a Porsche. He wanted to drive around in a black Porsche, but he was so keen, as there was no black one available, he settled for an orange one. But my brother, who helped me at the gallery at the time, on bringing it up from Stuttgart in order to be shipped from Hamburg to London, you know, wrecked it on the way, overturned several times. So he had to wait in the end anyway. But he did get his Porsche. So that was the London visit, and then he returned to California because his wife was getting homesick. I think his wife was mostly the reason, but he also wanted to reconnect with the scene in Los Angeles, and then he was looking around for a new space, and that's how he ended up at Windward Avenue.
One thing we were struck by is how the boxes evolved when you showed us the pictures of the London. Could you describe that a little bit? He actually started to make some that were abstract or just environments without the figures.
Yes.
It changed it, and then the figures changed as well.
Well, yes, first of all, the figures were now always made from wax, whereas earlier pieces, they were still made from clay or from a mixture of clay and wax, I think. And so the London pieces are different insofar as they, you know, they had a series of figures, and they sometimes showed movement at various stages, like early photography. What's the name of the photographer who photographed movement first? Muybridge. Muybridge, you know, is a little bit like that. And so he had a figure rolling on the floor in one particular position, and in the next, and in the next, like this. And so they suggested a movement. or girls walking on a beam of wood. It was balsa wood, and that was the same girl in various poses moving through a movement. That was the kind of work that he did at the time, and that he also showed at Ileana Sonnament. And I still have a number of those pieces because I bought all those pieces that he did at the time in London, and we went together sometimes in my car, where we had the pieces in the back on a flat bag, and we put them on the ferry in Harwich, and went for a 24-hour ride or 22-hour ride across the night sea to Hamburg. And we were sitting up, you know, smoking on the highest level near the what is it, the chimney or something of the steamer there, looking at the waves and looking at the moon. It was very nice.
Tell us about the film that you produced with Bob in London. and the
Yeah,
title.
he wanted to do a film, and this had to do also with the
Will you start again and just say the artist's name?
Oh yeah, Bob Graham really wanted to get into films. As he did or mimicked movement in the sculptures that he did at the time, showing figures at various stages of a particular movement. He was interested in scenes or in a kind of theatrical way of doing this, bringing the little scenes to life. And he did that with this movie, which he called Soft Orange. And he worked with an English artist. The name eludes me for the moment. You know him. He was quite well known at the time. Yeah, remember? And the two, Anthony Donaldson, and the two of them worked together on this little movie. And recently, when there was an exhibition, or like 2 or 3 years ago, when was it? No, at Doug Christmas's gallery in Los Angeles, the film was shown for the first time in many, many years. And I was the only one who had a copy left on 16mm film. And of course, Bob transferred it to a digital film, and then it was shown in one room at the gallery. It's a pretty crazy little film with guitar music, B.B. King, I think it is, underneath. Not very accomplished as a but a beautiful little document.
Well, it feels so much of the time period when you see it. It just
Yeah.
feels like a perfect, reflection of what was that feeling in
Yeah.
in London in the '60s. But how did you show the film in London? What was the venue in which you showed
Oh,
it?
we didn't show it at all. Oh, that was a very short film, and it could only be shown within an exhibition. If you have an exhibition of works by Graham, you have a room where you showed this. And I think I did this once. There wasn't that much interest in the film. I did sell one copy of the film to a collector in Cologne. His name was Wolfgang Hahn. He's a very famous collector, and he had a beautiful collection of things. Wolfgang Hahn also bought one of the early environmental pieces from Bob, and he bought a film. He had an interest in all kinds of things that artists produced, and it wasn't home decoration for him. It was, he was interested in the activity and the artist and all that.
It was a piece of art.
Great guy, and and most of his work is now distributed in many museums. Very famous collection, Wolfgang Hahn.
So you produced the film and put up the money for it, but there wasn't really an idea. It was really just more of a.
Well, it was something nice to do and exciting to do and getting involved in and all that. And always there was the hope that we might find a market for it, or find some way of either selling the movie or selling the rights, or but we had no clear idea how to do that. And there wasn't a market really, an art market at the time. It was completely different. I mean, one of those pieces there, was $2,500 was the retail price for an early piece at the time, if I remember correctly. And yes, he did do also abstract pieces. So he was getting involved in the perspective that is created by the 4 corners of the interior of the box and in the interiors, and he was working very much on the interiors. And then he started to do only the interiors, which were, in my opinion, very typical of his work and of his particular way of looking at things. It wasn't all about sex and the girls and all that. It was really about something else, a kind of mysterious world, an inner world, let's say, you know, like a psychological environment or some, you know. So these abstract boxes showed very much in what kind of a mood the artist found himself when he did it, what he was thinking about, and some are very dark and very kind of aggressive, you know, with a lot of barbed wire in it and strange aggressive things, and others were quite serene and very different. So these are psychograms, I would think, and I may have told you at one time that he also did a sculpture which is now in the museum in Hamburg. I sold it to them, and it has a slanted surface of water made from clay that he modeled and painted in bluish tones. And at one point, this thing tilted a little bit, and so we had to get inside, and the restorer went inside to put it upright. Now, hidden behind this was a little construction in cotton ball and some little thing there, which gave the piece a secret magic. So he was trying to exert power on the viewer by having something hidden that was exercising some pull or push or whatever. So he was always thinking in those terms. And so therefore I was not astonished to see the abstract pieces. I think they're very beautiful and very valid, even although most people will think that his work is only about nudes. That's not true. Bob Graham also did fragments, as you know, when he did the bronze pieces. And the fragments reflect a little bit of this way of doing psychological things there. There is a certain degree of aggression because he made forms, sculptures in wax. He had a form and made a wax cast, and then he would finish the surface of the web cast until it was perfect and gate it then, and then do the cast, the lost wax cast in bronze. And after working with them for a long time, trying to perfect them and all that, you know, you can feel maybe a little bit of resentment of having to deal with these problems all the time. In any case, you know, having made something very, very precious and also something very concentrated that exercises a lot of power. If you put one of those figures in a room, you will see that they're very commanding, even although small. And so having taken so much care for such a long time for them, I think he had an impulse to destroy them, and so he beat them up and cracked them and put them to pieces and all that. And then he was casting the pieces as these fragments, and I think that is a very unique and very important part of his work. I personally own quite a few of them, and I wouldn't like to let them go. They mean a lot to me, I think. That's where the artist comes out best.
Did he have an innate interest in the fabrication process and working with foundries, and did you help him when he was in Europe?
Well, you know, Bob Graham was not a man who had any experience in bronze casting when he started to work in bronze. And there was nothing in America. No one was active in casting figurative bronzes. So there was not a technology that was known like in Paris or in Italy, where you can find these shops in certain places and you have an experienced work staff afterwards. He had to build all of that himself with a lot of setbacks. And he studied bronze casting and the technical side of it very intently. And we traveled together many times to Italy. and went to the casting places there and looked at how, for instance, Renaissance sculpture has been cast, and he took a great interest in seeing that they too had lost cast, because sometimes the cast doesn't really come out fine and there are holes in it. And then he would go and do another wax cast and then cast it again, maybe doing the gating a little bit differently. In the Renaissance, what they did, even with very famous Donatello sculptures and so, they sometimes just, cast a piece and put it in there. If there was a big piece missing here, they put one in and bolted it a little bit and sanded it over and all that. So they were not as attentive to that kind of detail. But Bob always cared very much about the immaculacy of the surface. And you will see that in his sculptures. They're always absolutely immaculate. And he didn't like to even sandblast them afterwards. He would really like them to come out perfect with that skin that they have. Very important.
I mean, you can see that the surface is
Yes.
so pristine.
Yeah.
What kind of person was Bob? What kind of personality did he have?
Well, very hard for me to say. I mean, he was my closest friend over many, many years. And he was a very generous person to speak with. He was very cunning. I mean, he had a staff of sometimes 14 people. He was always out of money because the projects that he undertook, in particular the big public sculptures that he did, were more expensive to produce than the money he could get for them. So he was actually subsidizing his own public sculptures, even although they kept him alive for a time. He was always maneuvering, galleries, private clients and all that, outsmarting everybody, including myself. So I paid for many pieces, but he never gave me. Later on, he then gave me other pieces. And we always had this thing going on. That was a given. With him, it was, you as a dealer, he didn't look at dealers as people that he wanted to necessarily befriend. But I became a friend of his, and pretty quickly, because we had similar interests and we had a thing going between us. And he always did deals with me. I was a dealer, and then I was also a friend. And then at one particular point, I was promoted to a patron. That meant he wouldn't give me a discount anymore.
Is that a promotion?
Yes, he liked people to be patrons, and that was how he looked at things. And like many artists, he was very selfish when it came to doing his work. That was the absolute top priority for him, both in terms of his time as well as in terms of the money that he had available, and everything was sacrificed for that. And he made many mistakes along the way in treating people the wrong way, rubbing them the wrong way, and mistreating dealers and things like that. But I think he has that in common with many other California artists who are not looking favorably on dealers. They think dealers are commercial, which is not really entirely true. A lot of them are really quite idealistic, but the artists have been mistreated by some of the dealers so many times that there is a prejudice going around in those circles, and that's very understandable. Other than that, well, I don't know what to tell you about it.
Did you think, were the Los Angeles artists, did they approach doing business in a different way than, let's say, New York artists that you worked with?
No. And many California artists went to New York and became successful here. Larry Bell signed up with Pace Gallery. Ed O'Shea signed up with Leo Castelli at first. And Ron Davis went with Leo. And there were other, Bob showed first with Jill Cornblee, if you remember her. And later with Gagosian. First with Robert Miller and then with Gagosian. So they all had business in New York, and went to New York frequently and talked to the dealers here. So no, that was the same. They knew how to do this.
Ron Davis is an interesting example in the sense that, you know, maybe you can tell us a little bit about when, you know, he was first making work, that there was a real excitement about.
Yes.
And maybe you can start off by, you know, saying his artist.
Well, Ron Davis was one of the artists that I put in the traveling museum show in Germany, and at the time was very, very trendy, very, very fashionable, very popular work. He showed with Leo Castelli, and it was almost impossible to get any work because everything was earmarked for the future. Plus, he kept a very large number of his best works for himself for the future, thinking that they would retain their value forever, which of course was not true. And I don't know how this happened, but he fell out of favor. And so nowadays you can buy them here or there for reasonable prices. And I think that's very bad, because I think he's an excellent artist and he should have continued to be successful. But he's not the only one to whom this happened. I've seen it happen with Artschwager twice in his life. I've seen it happen to John Wesley. I mean, those are New York artists. But it happened to California artists. Billy Al Bengston was an absolute star in the 60s, showing with Ferrus and showing with Aquavella in New York and with other galleries, and the prices were high and expensive. And then it became quiet around him, and other artists came to the forefront and stepped into the limelight, and that was that. And this struggle for survival is what most artists have in common, and few artists are successful all the way through on the same level of success.
What did you think when you first saw the resin paintings of Davis? Did they have much of an effect on you?
Yes, yes, I really liked those paintings. They were very representative of the light on the West Coast, very much California art. Sorry, I have spoken so much.
Do you want water or something?
I will have a little tea. Have you still not asked enough questions?
What? We're not asking enough questions?
I said, have you still not
No.
asked enough?
We have to do some more. But Billy Al Bengston is a good, I mean, he's another artist who you worked with a lot. You know, you
Yes.
did 3 exhibitions of him, so maybe you can just start off by saying his name and, you know, your experience of first seeing the work and your relationship with him.
Well, Billy Al Bengston was one of the first artists I saw when Nick Wilder brought me to his studio. And subsequently, when I stayed in California at prolonged periods of time, I always saw him, and I stayed at his place and on Mildred Avenue many times, and he became a friend too. And everybody liked to go to Billy's parties. There were movie stars, there were celebrities, there were the few important collectors that were active in California at the time. They always came to Billy's parties. And you know, we had a good time. We went running together on the beach. He was an excellent sportsman, still is. And yeah, that was my relationship with Billy. He's an old friend. When I went to see Bob Graham twice shortly before he died, I went over to Billy too, and I took photographs of him sitting next to Bob on Bob's bed when he was so sick already. That was in November, and he died in December. And so Billy was close to Bob as well, and he was part of the scene.
What kind of work was Bengston making back then?
Well, he was making the dentos, you know, and they were the first that I did, but at the same time he did paintings on canvas with this particular symbol in the middle, you know, the sergeant's stripes in the middle. So he worked in all mediums, and he always did his watercolors. He's a master in watercolor. Absolutely beautiful things, and he has a broad oeuvre, very, very broad oeuvre, and much larger than one would think. And well, in the years after that, he changed very much. You know, he went through various phases, particularly during the time when he lived in Hawaii, when he made figurative paintings and portraits and very sometimes humoristic or witty and strange figures. The stick man, the running stick man, which is probably a self-portrait, and all that. You know, strange sense of humor that he has. I love these paintings. I think they're wonderful. I have quite a number of them, but I think they didn't catch on very well, right? I think that was one of the reasons why, you know, the public wants the same thing all the time. Once you're established as an artist, you have an established brand, because these are brands that need to be developed, then you better not change, because the public demands the same thing. If you change, you run the risk that you fall out of favor. And this happened to Billy too. He's back now, but you know, for many years it wasn't the case.
Did you watch him making the dentos? Because they're incredible objects.
I never watched him making these objects, but he was getting into, I mean, he was a motorcycle race driver, and they painted the motorcycles and they painted their cars, and they, you know, in California, the particular car culture coming out of the slums, really, you know, low riders and they painted the outside of the car, sprayed them with all that, you know, and he just transported that to the dentos, and the dentos, because he dented the, what do you call it, metal before he sprayed them, and that gave a very fascinating effect of reflection of the light on the painted surface. And his first exhibition of these, or one of the first, at Rico Mizuno's gallery, was in candlelight. You basically couldn't see anything on the paintings. There was tables with candlelight and the paintings behind it, you know, and the light flickered, and the paintings were all. It was about light, very humorous too. That, you know, very much pop art in a way too.
Did you go to any of his artist studio exhibitions?
Yes, many.
So will you start by...
I saw one recently.
Yeah. Will you start by saying what they were and explaining them and saying the name? The artist studio.
Oh, the artist studio exhibitions?
Yeah.
Oh, you know, Billy Bengston held exhibitions at the artist studio. It was a way of becoming independent of galleries, selling your things to the public that you knew, inviting friends over for drinks, and it was like a public relations affair for an artist. Sometimes more private, easier, and less commercial than the galleries. And they had a very nice atmosphere, and you know, the people who got together there mostly knew each other from past experiences, and you know, there was just a bunch of friends buying things from him. Very nice way of doing it. Bob Graham did it too. Bob Graham had shows on Market Street. You know, he had a room where from time to time he did exhibitions. He invited some people and did exhibitions. Not that the dealers particularly liked it, you know, because basically he was selling behind their back, you know, in the eyes of the dealers. They were putting their reputation and their money behind the artist, supporting him. That's what they thought. But obviously, you know, particularly in a guy like Bob Graham, he needed so much money for casting and to support his large staff. You know, the dealers couldn't keep up with the demand for money that he needed to continue to do bronze casting. So there was no way of, you know, so Bob had to go that way in order to keep the dealer margin for himself. Yeah.
Other than Bob and Billy, who would you say that you became closest to of the LA artists?
Bob Graham, yes.
No, other than Bob and Billy. Who?
Oh, I was close to Ed Ruscha, you know, we hung out a lot, you know. As you see this in the West Coast catalog of the traveling exhibition, you see a photograph of my first wife with Joe Good and Andrew Shea, and and she was also a model in one of the early sculptures of Bob Graham, and so Joe and Ed were close friends. Also Larry Bell. Ron Davis moved away from Los Angeles when he built his building there in the hills, and I didn't see much of him anymore. But really it was Bob Graham and Billy Al. Those were the people closest to me.
Can you talk a little bit about when you first saw Ed Booth? Did he have a studio on Western? Was he in Hollywood?
But Joe Good?
Rouchet.
Ed Rouchet and
Yes. Well, he had a number of studios. The last one I saw was Electric on Electric Avenue in Venice. And he had one on Western, that is very true. And Joe Good had one there as well, if I remember correctly. Yeah, but I'm not that familiar where exactly he was. I thought that he spent time in New York as well for a while, no? Maybe, I'm not sure.
yeah.
Whatever.
Did you have memories of the studio on Western?
No, I don't recall.
What did you think of Ed and Joe? They were old friends from Oklahoma.
Yes. I think they came to Los Angeles in the same car at one point. They both boys from Oklahoma, that is very true. They were very close, and yeah, but I don't know too much about that relationship. They had separate studios, and to me they were just separate artists, That part of the history I was part of.
Was there something about Los Angeles that was unique, like the city itself, whether it was, the beach culture or the sun or the surf and the cars? How did that culture of Los Angeles affect the work that you were seeing, or did you feel like it had an impact?
I think it did. There was definitely a particular culture there. Living by the beach and in the sun, it makes a big difference. And artists paint or do or work with what they see. And so that environment played a big role in there, I think. And you'll see it in, when they started working in plexiglass, for instance, Larry Bell with these reflections. Then you have all the artists like Doug Wheeler or Robert Irwin working with light, or Nauman even, working, with air, the almost invisible, the transparent, and that was a big part of the culture. And I think it came out of the experience of the light and the landscape there, and also out of the experience of the car culture, painting those cars and making life beautiful. It was a surface mentality, or how do you call it, a cult of the pretty surface.
That's good.
That is rather unique. I didn't find that in New York at all. It is definitely very different from what was happening over here.
Just briefly, what was the response in Germany of the LA artists? Or was there a response?
No, as I said, it was polite. The response in Germany was polite. They said, "Oh, wow, very interesting," but they didn't have any particular opinion, nor did they catch, the kind of surface cult that was active in California, or how it was different from New York art, and how it was different from pop art. It was just another thing that was happening at the time. And the 60s and early 70s were a very, very rich time. Not only in art, but also in, let's say, jazz music and film, so people were spoiled. There was something new and beautiful all the time, and as a dealer you could go out and pick just about everything, and it became important and interesting over time. Easy pickings.
Can you talk a little bit about the exhibition, the museum exhibition you were? How did you come up with that idea?
Do you want to take a break? Does he want to take a break?
I really think I have talked enough. No, I can tell you a little bit about the museum exhibition because the response in Germany to the West Coast art was, you know, not enthusiastic. You know, they were interested. They looked at it. Some of them liked it. Some of them didn't. But they looked at them as individual artists and didn't quite distinguish between New York and Los Angeles. And I wanted to particularly promote the California artists because I have been very active with them. I liked their work. And so I thought I might organize an exhibition of several California artists together, which could be a museum exhibition. And a museum director I knew agreed to put on this exhibition and do a catalog and make it a traveling exhibition to 4 other institutions in Europe. And I put together this exhibition and started to collect the works or get them from the artist, either on loan or buy them. And that's how this exhibition came about. And that was quite successful. And the book is still a reference book that many people have. And subsequently, a collector in Germany, Reinhard Onnersch, who also has a gallery, or had a gallery at the time, but is a big collector now, and no longer active as a dealer. He did an exhibition, and he did a little catalog called 9 from the West Coast. And he is still very interested in Graham. Recently bought a piece of Graham's, one of the early pieces that he particularly likes. And so he got very much involved in the West Coast artist. And since then, it has been something that is known in Germany, and people know what it is.
Tell us the name of the exhibition, the traveling show.
West Coast USA, it was called. I gave you a catalog. You have the catalog. You see the photos in it. Yeah.
And the text by Helene Weiner.
Mm-hmm.